You're listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner, your source for investing made easy. Here's Andy Tanner.
Welcome to Cash Flow Academy podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner. This is where we do our best to make investing simple. And I have a wonderful guest to join us on the podcast today. We have Howard Yaruss. Howard, thank you so much for being here. He has written a book called Understandable Economics, which captures two of my favorite things, economics, but simplicity, understandable. So it's understandable economics because understanding our economy is easier than you think and more important than you know. So with that, Howard Yaruss, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me here, Andy. I'm so pleased to be here and to talk about this subject. It's a passion of mine because economics is just not taught in school. Did you take a course in economics?
Well,
in high school?
Not in high school, and even the one in college, it's just as well been written in Japanese. So the understandable part, even though it was taught in college, the understandable part was missing.
You stole my thunder. I was about to get to college. For the minority who did take economics in college, it's usually presented as an array of formulas and jargon and technical information. Students, I think, do not have a better understanding of the economy after the course than they had before the course. So it's just not taught well. The point I make in the book, one of the most fundamental points I make in Understandable Economics is not like physics. It's not like biology. It's more like, it's a social science, like psychology. It's how human beings react. It's how they react to money and the resources in our economy, but it's still about how human beings react. It's like going to a psychiatrist and the psychiatrist saying, oh, let me plug everything into a formula and I'll have a diagnosis. It's a social science. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work like biology. It doesn't work like physics. And that's where we have to start. That's the position from which we have to start to understand how the economy works, to realize that it's not the bunch of the array of formulas in your economics textbook in college.
So you teach at New York University.
I sure do. Yeah.
And I will tell you, and everybody knows this, I struggled in school for some reason. I don't know if it was thick head or whatever, but I really struggled finding something I could sink my teeth into. And I think it's more difficult to do well when you're searching and you're not passionate about what you're doing. And maybe I was a little inherently lazy. Let's admit that too. Mm-hmm. But this is the closest I will ever get to attending I won't be accepted, but to actually attending New York University. This is as close as I'm going to get. So I'm pretty excited. Give us a little bit of your background. What was your pathway that said, hey, I'm really interested in this topic? I mean, you have a law degree, Brown University, University of Pennsylvania. A lot of academic achievement, coming up through your academic career. What made you want to teach this topic and really dive into it?
Well, I grew up in a family that often had financial difficulties. My father owned a grocery store and I used to work there. And I really became very much aware of the great differences in wealth, in opportunity, in resources. And it basically fascinated me. And some people were discouraged by it. Some people were crushed by it. Some people became determined to overcome them. I just became fascinated by it, how that came about, and what could public policy do to make everyone better off. So that was my great interest back then, and it carried through until this day, because so much rides on having a thriving economy and having opportunity. It makes the difference between a nation that's provides opportunity and resources for people and a nation that could potentially fail. So that's why it's something that fascinates me, and it's something that I think every American should be concerned with because it affects all of our destinies.
Now, there's when I speak to people who have written a book on economics, there's really often one or two or both things that happen. Some folks, and I feel the same way about both, but The first thing is you have, let's say, just take my home country, the United States. And while we have a global audience, I think everyone can superimpose this on their own country. So let's take my home country, the United States. If a person goes into, say, a voting booth, politically, and they're unaware of economics, they're unaware of particularly some of the forces. One of the sayings I'll often employ is that policy and demographics affects our future, particularly economically. In school, I learned legislative branches and judicial branches and executive branches, but I didn't learn anything about the Federal Reserve or monetary policy. And in learning what Congress was, we didn't talk about fiscal policy. So when a person goes in there and they are at a loss or it's outside of their purview, when we think about things like unfunded liabilities, commitments we've made that loom, not money we borrowed, but rather money we've promised that eventually we will have to borrow.
Pension obligations comes to mind.
Assuming our GDP doesn't triple, we're going to have to borrow because we won't be able to tax our way out of it. We have growth of economy, we have taxation, and we have spending. We could increase taxes, reduce spending, grow the economy. Those are sometimes opposing. It's tough to do all three at the same time. And if a voter doesn't understand that, how does that affect us, as a society? Now, the second reason, a person, reads this book is a personal gain or personal benefit. The more I understand economics personally, the better I can navigate my own investing and perhaps, my own decision making as an investor. I don't know that either the social goal is being achieved or a personal goal. What do you have to say on that? And what would be your main focus of why people would read your book?
Well, I have 2 points to make on that. The first is just a comment on our educational system. I went to high school in New York City. Trigonometry was required, but economics was not.
Interesting.
I have a healthy respect for math, but come on, trigonometry. I understand it's important for some engineers, but I think it's. I'm going to use the word shocking that is a course that's required, whereas economics is not required. So, given that we all have, most of us have not. Most Americans have not taken a course in economics, and those who have usually got the same jargon and formulas that you got and left them no more knowledgeable how the economy works. We have a real problem here. And why is it important to understand the economy? That underlies this whole discussion.
Yeah.
Because if we don't understand it, we're reliant on pundits and quote unquote experts and influencers and Twitter celebrities and TikTok whatevers to tell us what to think. And it's just too important to be left to social media echo chambers to make these decisions for us. These are important decisions: how society divides its resources, how we're going to grow, how we're going to provide opportunity. And I think to outsource it to some quote unquote expert or to someone on YouTube or whatever is a mistake. You're not going to get the best public policy that way. And I'll just add that the people who are speaking the loudest often have an ulterior motive. And so I think they're arguably the worst people to rely on.
Well, I'll reveal my motive right now for people. I'm an education advocate. And I've been that way. Similar to you, we didn't grow up in poverty at all. My parents always had food on the table, but my father was a teacher. He was the pastor of our community, and he taught Bible classes. He taught a seminary. So we didn't have much, but we always had, for our needs. So I had the same passion you did. I want to learn this stuff. So I've always had a passion. Yeah.
This was before, full disclosure, before the election of Donald Trump. I asked the class whether I was a Republican or a Democrat, and they actually didn't know, and I took that as a great achievement until
that's a huge achievement.
Until I thought about the possibility that they just weren't paying any attention, so they didn't know anything.
Well, politically speaking, I think it's great to have checks and balances, and if everything was ubiquitous, we'd probably be in a lot of trouble. I try to stay out of those wars as much as I can, because at the end of the day, well, I really like what Warren Buffett said about it. He's been investing since he was 14 years old. He bought his first stock, I think he was 14. That's like the 40s or something like that. And he said, I have invested under every US president, and most of the time I've been investing under someone I didn't vote for. Mm-hmm. And I really believe this. In fact, maybe you could comment on this. There is, tell me if I'm a little altruistic or maybe a little too libertarian, maybe in this thought. But I really believe that there is no government policy that has the horsepower to overcome a lack of sound personal economic policy. In other words, no matter how well they did on whatever they did, if I don't know what I'm doing, I can't prosper to the degree that I would have. On the flip side of that, even if the government financial statement is awful, which it is, that doesn't mean that has to curb or stop me from prospering in my own financial statement. So maybe that kind of libertarian view of mine is like, I get up in the morning, I can read this book. I can go on Amazon right now and say, understandable economics? Okay, that's for me. Why? Because understanding our economy is easier than you think. It's more important than you know. So thoughts on that? This can make a huge impact on people's lives, regardless the decision to buy assets and the decision to have a family budget meeting every week is much more important maybe to that person than the decision they make in the voting booth as far as how their own life is going to turn out. What do you think?
You make an excellent point that businesses can thrive under basically any administration. As long as there are clear rules for businesses can adapt, and some will adapt better than others. So there's an absolute need for people to understand what's going on. It's not as difficult as a lot of quote unquote experts make it out to be. And for them to assess what's going on. Again, businesses thrive under a variety of circumstances, and American history proves that. Businesses have thrived under all sorts of administrations. And so it's important, particularly for investors, to understand that, to not say, well, business is going to do it. The stock market has done better under Democratic administrations. And then there's the question of causation and correlation. Well, was it the policies that those Democratic presidents had, or were there other things going on in the economy? The president does not dictate the stock market. So it's important for people to understand the context of the economy and to figure out what is going to thrive, because thank God, this is a great nation and it's done very well, and I hope it will still continue to do well. And so people need to be able to understand what's going on in the economy, to see what actually is going to prosper and what is going to go by the wayside. And they need to make the most effective investors, I think, make those decisions for themselves. They don't follow the pack, because following the pack isn't necessarily the way to get the best returns.
I'd like to just close that loop. You mentioned that people get their information from pundits or from our media. When I watch Fox and CNN, I feel like I'm watching the same show, just insert different names. We're awesome, they're awful. We're righteous, they're evil. We do everything right, they do everything wrong. It's just a mess. And I think what the point, why would someone read this? Well, because you become empowered, because most of that social media and most of that news, or perhaps we don't live in the information age, perhaps we live in the misinformation age now more than anything else.
Well said.
I mean, really, it's astounding. Without personal knowledge, A, it's very tough to sift through all that stuff and know who's telling the truth. And B, most of that narrative preaches a gospel of, you don't control this. If our guy doesn't get in, everything's terrible. And you need to fall in line with our ideology or you have no choice. Where I believe the opposite is true. If I really have an understanding of economics, and someone makes it understandable, then I can certainly develop my own opinions. And for me, it's a very empowering purview to say, look, I can impact my own life regardless of what goes on there. Let's talk about a few things that have come about. I'd like you to touch on. Let's talk about currency. In the 1800s, I was fascinated with the banking era of the 1800s because you had wildcat banks, you had local banks that would issue currency, saying, "Hey, here's our currency. It's backed by specie, supposedly. You trust it." And the further away you got from that bank, the less they trusted your currency. And of course, through various tumults and booms and busts, we said, hey, maybe we do have a central bank. Okay, great. So the US dollar backed by gold, Bretton Woods, everyone likes the US dollar. We're the reserve currency of the world. 1971, Nixon pulls the plug. France is wants to cash in their gold. He pulls the plug. Now we have a fiat currency for 30 years or 71. Am I really that old?
More like 50 years.
50 years. What happened there, man? 50 years. And now we have this idea of digital currency, a currency that is really interesting. Bitcoin, for example, it can exist. It needs to be maintained. Like I can sit gold on the table, no maintenance. Bitcoin is electrically maintained, and as it grows, it demands tremendous energy to have the money survive. I don't think maybe I'm ignorant, but I'm trying to think of any other currency in history that needed to be fed, that actually had an expense to it to maintain its viability. Well, I like your thoughts on crypto of all kinds. What do you think?
You used an interesting word, as it grows. It hasn't grown. It hasn't grown in its ability to buy things, to serve as a medium of exchange. Go to your local stores, see how often they take Bitcoin. It has not grown in acceptability at all.
Yeah.
It grew, past tense, in value very significantly. At one point when I was writing the book about 2 years ago, it was about the market cap of all of the cryptocurrencies. The sum of the value of all of the cryptocurrencies was about 2 trillion. It's now about 1 trillion. Yeah. So it's halved in value. It's a digital asset. And the question is, will it survive or won't it survive? It has to have a purpose, and it can serve as a store of value like gold. I would argue gold is much better because it's stood the test of time, literally millennia, and also has some value in jewelry. I don't see much value for cryptocurrency other than black market transactions and other illegal activity. So
that echoes Warren Buffett.
It is something that some people need. So I think it will probably survive for that reason. I'll ask one question about cryptocurrency. If you have a problem with your checking account, you know how frustrating it could be when you call the 800 number and you get someone who sometimes doesn't even speak English well. Well, could you imagine if your bank did not have a number, did not have a physical presence, did not even have a physical existence anywhere, no customer service, you had no idea what the rules are? Could you imagine how difficult it would be if that were the case? Well, that's the case with cryptocurrency. And, they say there's 22 million Bitcoins, and that's the maximum. How do you know that? Who are you going to sue if they make 23 million of them? It's just the Wild West. There's no regulation of it whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so it's something, it surprised me how much it's caught on. And I think because there's a lot of people, there's a history of bubbles, and people want to believe. And yes, some people made a lot of money. It has a market cap now of $1 trillion.
Yeah.
That means people have made $1 trillion. Even today, that's a lot of money. And people get excited by that.
So when I look at crypto of all kinds, Ether, Bitcoin, or even if a central bank says, hey, we want to keep control of this and we want to track everything you do by our digital currency, and we can tell how you vote, we can tell your citizens, China type scary stuff of tracking. If I look at it through an economic lens, I might look at it this way. I can be a producer or I can be a consumer. It seems to me that if we're going to have good capitalism, I'm going to say, all right, I'm going to serve the world and I'm going to produce something and I'm going to make it as cheap as I can and I'm going to make it as good as I can. And I'm going to try and beat all the others and make up the difference in volume. I'll go low price, but I want to sell more. If I do that, if I say I'd like to be a net producer, in other words, as a stock investor, I tell my sons every time we go to the gas pump, I say, we're buying energy. We're buying energy. But look at how much we produce, and we make more money from dividends and maybe some writing some covered calls to cheat a little bit, but we make more money as a producer of energy, as a shareholder, than we ever put in our car. And that's the deal, right? Produce, give, produce, don't consume. So if I take that attitude, the hell do I care what currency they give me? Whatever the order of the day, if it's dollars, great, I'll take them. If it's gold coins, great, I'll take them. Because it's not the currency that's going to make me successful. How do you get dollars right now? Well, someone rents a house of mine and they pay rent, right? I give them a great rent. I give them a great deal. Well, if they want to pay me in dollars or gold or Bitcoin, or they say, hey, I got chickens out back. Here's some eggs for a month, right? Whatever. To me, it isn't about the currency. It's about, am I producing, am I a net producer in my life or a net consumer in my life? Thoughts?
I completely agree. The goal in the economy is to create value. That's the ultimate goal. But it's important to have a currency that has a reliable value. And Bitcoin just does not have that. It was sold originally as a hedge for inflation, and it's done much worse. It's
volatile. Yeah. If I'm in Argentina and I see the currency going up and down every day, I say, well, I don't trust my government. I think that's a lot of the appeal too, is to think that they think, okay, the problem is, this is where people on the extreme, if you have the left and the right, I guess the libertarians are up and down. I don't know where they are on the spectrum, but an extreme libertarian view would say, look, government should have nothing to do with the money. We should take it out of their hands. And I think that's part of the appeal there. But I think it seems that there's a yin and a yang and a balance between regulation and freedom. If you let people go nuts, it becomes corrupt so fast. And yet if you tighten everything, you can't do anything. So striking that balance is what the government's role has to be.
Well, in the first chapter of Understandable Economics, I really say there are two systems. One where the government decides everything, every conceivable decision, and the other one where it's a libertarian's dreamland where everything is done by individuals. Neither works. And there's no example on the planet Earth, even North Korea. There's some private enterprise. And even in Singapore or places like that, there's some, the government provides roads. Actually, in Singapore, I think it's like 60% of people live in government supplied housing. The point is that we all have a hybrid system here where the government makes some decisions and people ideally make a lot of decisions on their own. But to have no rules, no roads, no infrastructure, it's a fantasy. And I understand that people can react because they feel the government is making too many decisions. But to go to the extreme where the government's not involved is just inviting anarchy and destruction.
Okay, so let's look at another side of that coin. So I was born in 1968, and when I was 8 years old, we had a bicentennial. It was a big deal. Carter's kind of struggling, and he's got a lot of interesting tax policy that he's trying to do, and it was an interesting time. And I remember as a young kid, after that, I can't remember when Ross Perot came on the scene, but I was as a kid when Ross Perot, and I just remember him. He was a lot like me. He's got a flip chart and trying to teach everyone economics. But what's amazing is, if my memory serves, we had not hit $1 trillion in debt in terms of bonds sold, right? And so we have a 200-year period before $1 trillion. Now in my lifetime, we're up at 33, and we're according to the Fed, we're getting close to 200 trillion in promises. So we have a fiscal issue. The Congressional Budget Office uses the word unsustainable. Certainly the GAO in their reports has used the word unsustainable for years. And I think even Janet Yellen's Department of Treasury in their reports would recognize that if we borrow and continue to borrow and continue to promise that there is this word unsustainable. On the other side of this, you have people like Warren Mosler who makes some interesting points with MMT. We have this modern monetary theory. Look, there is no real consequence to spending in terms of debt. There's only consequence in printing too much and inflation. And so that in a way, if someone came to me and said debt is bad, if Gordon, if Ramsey or Susie Orman said debt's bad, I'd say baloney. Look at my debt. My debt in real estate is I'm shorting the US dollar. I'm borrowing dollars at a high value, spending them on something. I'm paying them back when they're worth less. So I'm a short position on the US dollar. It's an enabler. It's an accelerator. It allows me to acquire an asset. I get all the tax benefits. I can borrow against that property tax-free and have with a refund. I mean, debt is an investor dream.
Yeah,
so
it enabled me to go to law school. It enabled businesses to start.
Buy
almost
a home.
Every position, exactly. Yes.
Even
responsible debt is a wonderful thing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Consumer debt can get away from you. So now, but then Warren Mosler or Stephanie Kelton comes out and says, "Yeah, well, but we play by different rules with debt. We don't have to be responsible with debt. We just have to control the money printing." Well, that's easier said than done. When you have an event, a war, a pandemic, whatever, print. This was not transitory inflation. We're not going back to. You're not getting your cereal box cheaper again. This is here to stay, in my opinion. So tell me about this. That's a long-winded question. Blah blah blah. My fault. Let me spit the question out. David Walker was the head comptroller general of the United States. He's the head of the GAO. He quits his job. And David Walker said something interesting. He was a very bipartisan guy, and he said this. He said, the biggest threat to the United States is not someone hiding in a cave in Afghanistan. The biggest threat to the United States is our own fiscal irresponsibility. I think I got that quote pretty close. Your thoughts on the debt, your thoughts on the unfunded liabilities that are looming, your thoughts on debt ceiling, saber rattling by both sides, and your thoughts on Fitch downgrading our credit rating, which is supposed to be risk-free. So if you're not AAA, that denotes risk, but bonds are supposed to be risk-free. What's your thought on?
I'll start with the Fitch downgrade. The risk is not an economic risk, it's a political risk.
Amen.
In the United States, as Alan Greenspan said, we have a printing press here in Washington. We can always repay the debt. So it's a question of political will and not economic ability. So that's the answer to Fitch. And they have raised a concern. Every time the debt ceiling comes up, there's some question as to whether the United States is going to default on its debt simply for political purposes. And that's
for
bad.
Spite. And it would be spite. I mean, it would simply be the vitriol and the hatred. I mean, they could pass whatever they wanted, but Newt Gingrich did it to Clinton, right? He said Clinton kind of got excited and had a landslide and kind of went a little too far. And then Newt Gingrich says, well, we'll do a contract with America. And he called his bluff and they shut it down for a while, furloughed employees. So it has happened.
And the time to have the debate is before you incur the spending and not before you have to pay for the spending you incurred. That's the time to have the fight, to decide whether to actually incur the spending and not whether to pay for it. So that's the political problem. And that's why the United States was downgraded. And it's unfortunate because it's a real black mark in the United States, and it will probably on some level increase the amount of interest we have to pay. The debt is obviously a very big issue. When I discuss it, I always say, do people really have a gut sense of the difference between $1 billion and $1 trillion? These numbers are so huge. It's like saying, oh, I had a sandwich for lunch today. I can't remember whether it was $10 or $10,000. I just don't remember, but it was good. That's the same order of magnitude between $1 billion and $1 trillion. So
I don't understand $1 trillion.
Right.
I don't understand.
understandable economics is take the 30 some odd trillion dollars of debt and divide it by the number of Americans. And it comes out to roughly $70,000 per American. That is a number all of us can get our heads around. It's not a number you have to rely on some pundit or some Twitter celebrity to tell you it's bad or good. It's a number you can make the decision yourself. Now, my personal opinion is $70,000 of debt per American too much. I go back to what it was spent on. If it's spent on great infrastructure and educating kids, as we were just saying before, great investments. You invested in real estate. I invested in a law degree and a bunch of other things, and they've done very well. If that $70,000 is wisely invested, I would argue it's a good thing. If it's just used to push obligations down the road, no, it's a terrible thing. So that's my whole goal in the book, is to get people to develop the tools to think about these issues, put the tens of trillions of dollars in some perspective, think about it on an individual level, $70,000 per person, and then think about whether that spending made sense, and to reach their own conclusions. Because my belief is the more people understand, the better conclusions they'd reach, the better policies they would support, and the better economy we'd all live in.
Let's say I'm listening to this podcast and I've been interested in learning more about money, and I've heard this term MMT. Can you explain to those people what it is and what your thoughts are on it?
Yes, I talk about it, MMT, in the book. MMT stands for Modern Monetary Theory. And my point is, it's not modern, it's not a theory, it may be monetary. All they're saying is that the government has a printing press, and it should not be bound to balancing its checkbook the way you and I are. Because the government has a printing press, it could print as much money as it wants until it starts to get inflationary. The real constraint on the government is not money, because it could create money, it's resources. If it starts dumping too many dollars on the economy and there's not enough resources, we're going to get inflation. That's modern MMT in a nutshell. So I say it's not modern because John Maynard Keynes talked about that.
It's Keynesian economics rebranded, right?
And it's also just factual. The government does have a printing press. You could go see it, and it does have the right to print as much money as it in its political wisdom decides to print. So, and it's not a theory either. It's just a fact. It's monetary. So I think it's a little bit misnamed. The reason I think it's gotten so much press lately is because some people have taken it to the next step to say deficits don't matter. And that's just wrong. I don't know if the MMT people wanted to go that far, but the fact is that's wrong, because there's a reason why we have constraints on how fast that machine can turn out the cash in our economy. And that's because if you let the politicians get their hands on it, they will rev that thing up to the highest possible speed, and you'll have hyperinflation the way you can have hyperinflation the way you had it in Germany and other countries. There's this anecdote about Hungary, where people went to a restaurant and sat down for a meal, and by the time they were done with the meal, the prices had changed. So that's hyperinflation, and it's very corrosive to an economy.
Yeah, but look, okay, let's talk about hyperinflation, because there's my grandfather came to the United States from Germany, and so I'm 3 or 4 years old when they take us off the gold standard, and he goes nuts. He was a metallurgist. He had a makeshift smelter in his property that OSHA would have destroyed him for if they didn't have those rules. And he told me I remember 3, 4 years old, he would just decry the bankers, and he'd tell me tales of the Weimar Republic and Zimbabwe and Venezuela and all this stuff. Is hyperinflation really on the table for the U.S.? I mean, one of my colleagues says, well, printing money works until it doesn't. Is that really something we could see in the U.S.? You look at the fiscal path we're on and the rate we're printing. Can that happen? Can we lose confidence in the U.S. dollar?
Not under the regime we currently have, because we have an independent Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, they did it. They're doing it right now. They raised interest rates.
Raised rates. Yeah.
Exactly. So as long as the Federal Reserve is independent and you have competent people, I'm assuming, at the head of the Federal Reserve, they will do whatever they need to do to counteract whatever fiscal policy Congress and the president are engaging in. The real risk is,
But well, let me interrupt you there. The play between the Fed and the Congress is very real, because when the Fed goes before Congress, who has oversight over the Fed, and someone like Janet Yellen or Alan Greenspan or Ben Bernanke or whoever's in the chair, Congress is grilling the Fed, but the Fed always comes back and says, well, someone's got to buy these bonds. Someone has to buy them. Isn't the Fed? Couldn't the Fed be caught in a trap if the fiscal irresponsibility continues? I mean, do they remain solvent and sovereign if we run debt through the roof?
Well, this is a great example of where the point I make in economic and understandable economics becomes relevant. If you think through the process and use common sense, you can figure it out. So what's going to happen if the US government goes mad? Tax cuts for all, spending like crazy. They'll be issuing these bonds, and eventually they'll have a really hard time selling them. The interest rate will go up, and people will not be as willing to purchase these bonds. And so what is the immediate, if there are two immediate effects? One, the government is going to have to cut back on spending. If they can't raise the money, they can't do the spending, or they can't give the tax cuts. So that's one check on the system. And secondly, the independent Fed would be taking steps to slow down economic activity because of the fiscal stimulus. So those are two checks on the system. The problem is if the government, Congress, and the president gets fed up and says, we want to spend this money anyway, and tries to undo the Fed's independence, that's where you have a potential for a disaster. But there's no sign. Well, actually, there's no sign. There's minimal sign of it now. There's talk of ending the Fed, and I don't know who gets control of the monetary authority at that point if you end the Fed. But right now, with an independent Fed and the obligation on the fiscal authorities to sell their bonds in the market, those are two checks on the system.
Economic systems, more government, more of a socialistic idea around the world, some places, more, I'm definitely in the capitalist camp, acknowledging, first of all, if you separate socialism and kind of set socialism and capitalism aside, and you just talk about good people and principles and culture, if someone wants something for nothing, that's a real rough place for you to expect to do well, an entitlement mentality. On the other side, if I am, Mr. Potter from A Wonderful Life, and I just want to control everything, and I'm just a rotten guy, either of those systems are really brutal if you have a culture of greed. And both are greedy if you think about it. I want everything and give nothing, right? I'm the freeloader that everyone decries. And, you got to have compassion. There are people with Lou Gehrig's disease. There are people who are older. There are people who we got to take care of. There's no question. There's also people who push that and feel entitled. So that's greedy. On the other hand, you got guys that would just crush anyone and put people to work at 5 years old. And, so understanding there's a goodness and an evilness to a person, I'm astounded and quite alarmed when I see particularly the millennial generation that is really, they seem to really like socialism ideas. And I think this country, the United States, is proven, if you just look at the advances in technology and the advances we've had and how the rest of the world has wanted it for so long, capitalism isn't perfect. But should we throw that out of the window? From an economic standpoint, when has communism ever worked? And what's your feeling on socialism and capitalism? That's a tough one. That's
an easy one, actually. Churchill said that about democracy. It's the worst system until you've reviewed all the others, and then you realize it's
well said.
The problem is that You said it's greedy to want something. I think everyone wants as much as we can get. The point is you need a system to channel that greed. This is Adam Smith and Gordon Gekko. Channel that greed into something productive. And that's why in the book I talk not about equality, because inequality has been increasing, but you have two goals: equality and productivity. You want both. You want opportunity for people. You want people to feel like they can get their share of the pie, but you also want to make the pie bigger. Those are the two constraints. And to just hand out things to everyone is not going to work. Again, we talked about this a few moments ago, that there are really two extremes. The government makes all these decisions and they're in charge of everything. And the other extreme is where there's really not much of a government and people are doing whatever they want. Neither works. The goal of the government is to maintain a market, and only a government can maintain a market with all the property rights and rules and infrastructure that requires, to allow people to pursue their own self-interest and create value for others. That's the way you pursue your self-interest, is by creating value for others. And that's why capitalism has created unprecedented wealth. It's changed the course of human history. As I make the point in the book, that for almost all of human history, up until the Industrial Revolution, people were pretty much uniformly poor and food insecure. It's only since the late 1700s, early 1800s, that there was this boom in productivity. And people, as old as I am, I don't remember that time. None of us remember that time. We've read about it in books, but it doesn't resonate with us. I remember when they were discussing Brexit, they interviewed this family in England on what they called the dole. They were on welfare, and they were sitting watching their big flat screen TV, and they were munching away on something. And they said they wanted Brexit because they can't imagine this situation being any worse. That shows a colossal ignorance of so many things. We don't have time for all the things it shows ignorance of. But that's the point. I think we're both agreeing with, that there needs to be a system that encourages people to contribute and rewards people for that contribution.
Shoot, for most of the world, most of the populations lived here was a peasant or a slave. You were a monarch or a pharaoh, or a peasant or a slave. I mean, I'll take freedom every day. I'm pushing my luck. You've been so kind with your time. I'm going to push my luck. Can you talk about the BRICS?
You mean
in terms of Brazil, Russia? Yeah. That as they coalesce and as they come together and they think about, I mean, if the US isn't the world reserve currency, Britain isn't the world currency, they're fine. Europe isn't the world's reserve currency. I mean, it isn't like you can't create wealth, and there's burdens to be in the world's reserve currency. But do you see I kind of look at China and the human capital they have and where they're at. I see Russia, and there's definitely some agendas that are not in line with the United States' best interest, I think. I mean, what's your thought on the BRICS?
Okay, first we have to put it in perspective. Just like the national debt, Russia's economy is smaller than Texas's. Russia is just not that important from an economic perspective.
Great point.
So that's the one thing. China, massive economy, by some measures bigger than the United States, but its current currency is not traded on the free market. Its currency is basically controlled by the government. It just doesn't work as an international reserve currency if the government is totally in control of it. So I don't think the US dollar has a real competitor for reserve status at this moment. They talked about the euro being a competitor to it. That hasn't panned out, and that is a big. That currency represents an enormous market, and it's freely traded, and it has not come anywhere near threatening the dollar's dominance as the world currency and as the reserve currency. So could a threat arise at some point? Possibly. So I don't see anything in the short term.
Last thing I'll ask you, and maybe there's more factors than this, but I'm going to try and make it simple and understandable. Fiscal policy: raise taxes, lower taxes, spend more, spend less, or spend differently, as you said. and GDP grows or shrinks. The GDP is the pie, that's our production. We get a slice of that. Taxation can get bigger or smaller. The dogma, I suppose, is lowering taxes stimulates the economy, increase of spending stimulates the economy. But in order to get control of our financial statement, we have to raise taxes, we have to cut spending. How do you get all three? I mean, how do you balance that to solve fiscal problems? You know, if you lower taxes, well, that doesn't help the debt. You increase spending, that doesn't help the debt. And if you grow the economy, that can help, but you have to do the things that hurt it to help it. Did I make that just really confusing for people right there?
Well, I'll make it really simple with two words: spend smart. The government needs to spend money. Unequivocally, there's an important need for the government to maintain the market, to assist with infrastructure, to enforce property rights, to establish law and order. It needs to be spent wisely. And if the government spends wisely and carefully, that should enable the economy to grow. As we discussed, everyone's out there trying to earn a living and create value, and the government should provide a market that encourages them, that enables them to do that, as well as provide opportunity for people aspiring to do just that.
It's pretty tough to do investment, though. If you break down the budget, you've got all the non-discretionary stuff. For example, I don't want to lose Social Security. My parents are in their 80s. I don't want them to go out and get a paper route, and I don't want them to work at Walmart as a greeter. Second of all, is you have huge healthcare costs. That's not an investment. That's expense for sure. And then you have government pensions, and you have income security type stuff. I mean, over half the budget's just going to give money, people that just need the money and they spend it. Now, that certainly will go back into healthcare, and all that money is spent back in the economy, sure. But if you have $457 billion going to interest next year, if you take that and invest, if you were able to take that kind of money and invest it, let's say, in cancer research, diabetic research, and that healthcare problem gets easier to solve because people are healthier and we got less problems and less expense there. So that idea of investing wisely, you get AI going the right way. That's a bigger space race, I think, than the space race was. You land AI, you really are in a profitable position. That's investment, right? Okay, last thing I'll talk about equality. I had two sons. They're now 15 and 17, and they're those poor kids. Their dad has brainwashed them since day one. And I used to show off a lot. I'd take my kids when they were 9 and 10 years old, and we'd travel around. We'd be in a big stage, a big conference. And I'd have my two sons get up at 8 years old or 9 years old and 10 years old. They teach monetary policy and fiscal policy to people, and it just blow everyone away. And it was really interesting. I said, son, very young, I said, son, let's play with the compounding calculator. That's what Warren Buffett was obsessed with as a teenager. You could be obsessed with it too. And I said, let's just see what would happen. And we started with a sneaker company. And I said, let's see if this summer we can make as much money selling shoes as an owner of this company through dividends and covered call writing as we will buying basketball shoes to go play in. Consumption versus production. And as they caught the vision of that, and they started playing with those numbers at very modest, very, very modest returns, historically average returns, without tremendous stock knowledge, just by mere participation in the broad market, they saw they become incredibly, incredibly wealthy. And that idea that, to me, that's where the equality could come from. Because if I don't give my kids a dime, but they show frugality, they show discipline, they work hard, at their paper route or whatever they're doing, and they just take some of those pennies and they invest consistently and wisely, you get to share. And I love the term shareholder. Shareholder is wonderful because I get my share of Apple. I don't know how to build an iPhone. Are you kidding me? I I barely know how to use my iPhone, let alone build one. But Steve Jobs says, if you want to participate with me, I'll share all this with you. Why don't people teach children to have an independent idea? Because that, to me, is equality. That's how you get to the equality. Buffett is not a Wall Street guy. He lives in Nebraska. He doesn't give his money to money managers. He simply said, look, Thomas Edison's a cool guy. I don't know how to make a light bulb, but I can buy GE. Duracell he owns. Fruit of the Loom he owns. Kraft Heinz. Why don't people learn to invest?
I have the perfect analogy for you. I grew up in New York City, and every New York City school child is taught, I don't know if you know this, that the Dutch bought Manhattan Island from the Native Americans for $24. Did you hear that story?
In trinkets, yeah.
And so in class, I asked, who got the better deal? And you can make the argument that the Native Americans got the better deal, because if you took $24 in 1624, invested it at 7% a year, and again, there was no Wall Street, but there were financial markets in London, they would have $9 trillion today, which is worth more than the entire island of Manhattan.
That is fantastic story.
Yes.
That is fantastic.
Yes, it's always presented uniformly in New York City public schools as this great tragedy. And yes, there are unequivocal tragedies for the Native Americans, but arguably that's not one of them.
You know, I need to give you a compliment. I don't remember the name of my economics professor. It's been 30 years. The teacher that was most meaningful to me in college was my basketball coach, because he made the biggest impact. And maybe it's because my economics teacher didn't make me run sprints or run stairs when I did it wrong. Maybe not. But I get a feeling that students are going to remember you for a long, long time.
Thank you for saying that.
Your simplicity, your clarity, your am I allowed to use the word charm? I mean, it's just it's fantastic to have this discussion with you. I do my very best to do an infomercial, unapologetic, when I have a guest on. My producers know what I like, and they know what kind of books I like to read. So I get to know the author and I say, okay, this is going to be one that's going to be great. How I often sell books to people, and my listeners know what's coming. What if you could take Howard Yaruss to dinner and pick his brain? Would you be willing to pick up the tab? You know, if you guys went out to dinner, you got to pick his brain. Would you pick up the tab? Of course you could. Well, I will tell you this, having written a couple of books poorly myself, you'll get much more of his thoughtfulness. When you write a book, you're organizing your thoughts, you're making very clear. You'll get much more by going to Amazon.com. For a few dollars, you get to add to your library. I want to read the title properly. What a beautiful title. Understandable. Love that. Understandable economics. Why? Because understanding our economy, it's easier than you think, and it's more important than you really know. So go to Amazon, pick that up. You can go to HowardYaruss.com. That's HowardYaruss.com and learn more. You've been just a delightful guest. I'm the luckiest guy in the world that I get.
I think I'm lucky this morning. This was a great talk. I really appreciate it.
Oh, just you're so gracious with your time to give us a full hour. And I'll tell you, go pick up the book, folks. Knowledge is power. It'll just change your life. The more you learn, you can navigate all that social media stuff. Fantastic. So last word. To anything you want to say to the listeners, any advice, any last words? Well, you mentioned that the learning about economics can help people improve their lives. I actually think it can improve our lives as well, because the less people are fooled by those with ulterior motives or those blowhards on all the social media platforms, the more likely they are to promote better public policy and make a better world for literally for all of us. So go out there and learn what you can. You've been listening and watching the Cashflow Academy podcast. We do our very best to make investing simple. I thank my guest. Thank you for listening. Hey, we'll see you next time. You've been listening to the Cashflow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner.
For more information on investing made easy, go to thecashflowacademy.com.